The following content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute means for diagnosis, healthcare advice, nor treatment. Make use of a qualified healthcare professional for such purposes.
Sometimes you will be required to summarize a research article. And in this particular case, we're going to look at one specific article that we will utilize in class. We're going to break down the sections, and I'm going to explain to you what it is expected whenever you provide a summary of a research article. The first thing, of course, is the introduction. And in the introduction, you're going to find the construct. So I need you, whenever you write your own introduction, you're going to explain to me what the construct is. And remember, the construct is the definition of the variables you're looking for. So for example, think about, we're studying confidence in undergraduate students and their applications, their willingness, for example, to apply to graduate school. So the construct, for example, would be confidence. I have to define confidence because what is confidence? So you have to define your terms, just like you would define wind resistance when you're looking into physics, for example. You have to define your terms. The theories or models. As you know, a theory is an explanation. It's an explanation that we're going to utilize later on in our discussion to interpret the results that we had in our study. You also want to be able to list the hypotheses. And a hypothesis, as you remember, is a prediction. A hypothesis as a prediction. So for instance, my hypothesis for this fictitious study can be social science students applying for a Ph.D. in clinical psychology will be less confident than a civil engineering student applying for a PhD program in civil engineering. Notice that in that particular case, I have attempted to make a prediction. That my social studies individuals are going to be less confident. Let's think about the next section that you're going to summarize, and that is the method. And one of the most important things about the method is tell me, who are your participants? Where did they come from? Did they come from an undergraduate program, a psychology department, an outpatient clinic, a student sample? Where did you get your participants from? Are they male, female, mostly male, mostly female? What's their age? What's their average age? We're also going to talk about the design, materials, and procedures. And as you know, we spoke previously about design, materials, and procedures in our previous lectures. The design is simply, what is the process? What is the statistical procedure that you are going to utilize in order to measure the data once you start gathering it from the participants? Materials is, what did you utilize in order to get set data from participants? So for instance, you might have been, for example, I used the XYZ confidence inventory from XYZ publisher. Graduate program, I use, let's say, a search engine, XYZ search engine. What exactly are you utilizing to gather set data? And the last thing that you would include in a summary is the procedure. I like to think about this as the steps. I like to think about it as the steps. What was your process? What was the process that you engaged in? You would list all of the steps. I contacted the IRB. I sent a proposal here. The IRB sent me a proposal on February XYZ. I published my survey in the student center in so-and-so university. You have to list every single step of everything that you had done. Now, let's talk about the results. And we spoke about the results, and in this particular case, we're talking about what the statistics were. What were my findings? What were the statistics? Notice that if we revert back to the methods, you have to list the design. Within listing your design, you need to tell me about the variables. The independent variable being that's being manipulated, and the dependent variable, the one that is being measured. So every time you see independent, I want you to think of manipulation, and every time you see dependent, I want you to see measured. If they included any tables or figures in their study. Generally, in scientific publications and scientific articles, peer-reviewed articles, you're at least going to find one. You are at least going to find one. It is pretty rare to find one that doesn't have either a figure or a table. Now, for the purposes of a summary, unless told otherwise, you should never copy it directly. You should always describe the table or figure. You should not copy it directly.
Like how detailed described, like just essentially like what the table was going over, or it okay.
The last thing you're going to include in your table is the interpretation. What did we find in that discussion? Something really interesting about the discussion section is that it generally provides limitations. It tells me what could have been better. It tells me what could have been better. It tells me what didn't go as planned. It tells me what did go wrong. And why is that? Well, first of all, because without that type of honesty, then your results are going to look misleading. So for instance, let's give you an example, and we're going to study the group of students in social sciences and the group of students in engineering. Generally, there are many males in engineering, and generally, there are many females in social sciences. Now, that is a limitation for my study because I would like my group to be representative. So I can bring that up as a limitation. For example, the vast majority, say for example, 150 out of 175 were males that I surveyed for their confidence in graduate school. And I would present that as a limitation because my results may not be representative of the average female engineering student that wants to apply for a graduate program and her confidence. So that is a limitation.
So design is just kind of how it was organized?
Design is basically the statistical procedure that you use. Did you use an experiment? Did you use a correlation? Did you use an analysis of variance? Did you use a naturalistic observation? What exactly was the process? So was it qualitative, quantitative? If it was quantitative, okay, what statistical procedures did you use? A chi-square, like we mentioned earlier. And ANOVA, like we mentioned earlier. Basically, what would that design look like statistically? Did I compare one group to itself before the assessment and prior to the after the assessment? Did I compare one group to a second group? Did I have one group and a control group? So that's the design. What did it look like statistically? Notice that for the purposes of this class, we don't want you to go past one page. Use full sentences, and these full sentences you're going to derive from your little table. Your little table is for your usage. So that you know, okay, they look into confidence and let's say willingness for college. So the concept number one is confidence, willingness to go to college. What theory did they use? The motivational theory from XYZ School of Thought of Psychology. And the hypotheses, which is what I mentioned earlier, saying social sciences students, I should say, will demonstrate less willingness when compared to engineering students who are applying for a Ph.D. program. Participants, undergrad students from so-and-so university from an engineering and social science department, recruited from a community college. Design, we conducted a 2x2 factorial design, so comparing two groups, two levels of the independent variable and the two levels for dependent variable. The procedures. I talked to the IRB. They gave me permission. I sent this survey this day to the student center, and then I met with them for an hour. Then you start listing each procedure. The statistic. So think about the outcomes, the mean, the standard deviation, standard error, right? What statistics do we have? In describing the figures and the interpretation with whatever limitations they listed. A good article would have limitations or recommendations for future research. You want it to be 1 inch all around. Normally in APA, everything is double space, but for this exercise, you're going to use single space. That's why it's in bold, because generally for APA, it's double space. When I say APA, I mean the American Psychological Association Manual for Writing, and in Times New Roman. Now, in this case, generally for APA, you do have headings. So you will have introduction, discussion, methods. However, we're only going to submit the 1 paragraph of that summary. But you do want to cite the references, or the reference, I should say, because you're only summarizing 1 article. You want to do that in APA format. And then after you have 1 line, skipped at the end of the paragraph. So what you want to do, if I can show you an illustration, what you're going to do is after that 1 line, you always want to indent the line. You always want to go and indent it. Now, what you are citing is the research article that is already posted in class under Canvas. You want to cite that article or Park Stam and colleagues. Do not try to add more information to the paper. I do not try to add more information to the paper. So for example, trying to fluff up, say, the title page and make it look fancy. The only thing we're looking for is that I know that you can summarize an article. And you're thinking, well, I'm not in psychology. This is going to help you for the rest of the articles you read. I need to know that you are in fact able to understand research, because then you will use this in other courses as well. Do not use direct quotes. If you use a direct quote, unfortunately, I have to give you a 0. Do not cite any other individuals other than Park Stam, because the intent is for me to see that you can summarize the 1 article. Yes, sir.
When it comes to direct quote, what if we do a still thumb and citation and everything?
When you have to do a citation, remember that the best way to do a citation is by referencing it yourself and not quoting directly, because I need to see that you understood that citation. For example, if you read the article of our fictitious study and you say, according to Ortiz, 2022, quote, students who have social studies as their program will score less. That's a form of parroting, as we call it. You're just repeating what I said, but I can't see that you actually understood what I was trying to say. So you want to rephrase it. You do want to put that quote like Ortiz 2022, but you can't quote directly because that doesn't tell me if you actually understood what I was trying to say. And in this case, with Park, it will be the same thing. You don't want to quote directly, not for this paper, and it's generally not recommended. Yes, sir.
So we're putting no quotation marks whatsoever?
Whatsoever. You should not quote anybody directly. How are you going to provide that organization for that paragraph? You're going to have the general purpose for each major heading. So for example, you have that introduction and explain what the purpose of that introduction was, the purpose of that method, the purpose of results, and the purpose of the discussion. And once you do that, so once you explain the purpose of the introduction, summarize the information that you found. Once you summarize the purpose of a method, summarize the information that you found, and so on. Use language that the article uses. So if the article uses the term anxiety, don't use tension. say in my study, I said social sciences, don't say sociology. Use the terms that the researcher is using. Now, if you want a very in-depth explanation for each of these sections, I highly encourage you to look at this video. That is basically the chapter we just covered, because the chapter that we just covered goes really in detail as to this is the introduction and these are the results. You alternatively can also schedule with me, our teaching assistant. So ultimately, if you need help for this paragraph, you can reference this video that explains very specifically what we just covered last week and today. Or you can alternatively come to me or come to RTA if you have any questions. You want to use past tense. Yes, ma'am.
Also, I'm wondering if in writing you do some form of like paraphrasing, at what point do you know the difference between if you're paraphrasing and you choose it in text citation, or if you are putting it like in your own words? Like, at what point do you know that you're not accidentally plagiarizing?
If you didn't quote, if you don't put that person's name and year there, then that's plagiarism. If it doesn't have a quote, I'm going to assume you said that, right? If it doesn't have Ortiz 2022, Peterson 2017, right? I'm going to assume that that sentence you wrote. That's how you know. Did this idea come from me, or am I getting this idea from the author? So I'm getting this idea from the author, and you put their name and year. Yes, sir. The citation. No, don't apologize. That's how we learn, right? Ask a question. If it didn't come from your noggin, you need to put the person's last name and year. Okay, you need to cite that person. In this case, it's going to be Mark Stammen, all 2010. You want to present information in past tense because the study already occurred. Always attribute the actions to the author, never to the study. A study can't study, can it? But authors can study, people can study. So you like to say something like, the authors concluded that social studies students XYZ, Ortiz 2022, but you wouldn't want to say the study concluded. The study doesn't conclude anything. Studies can't write. The authors can write. Say Ortiz 2022 concluded that XYZ. Please use proper grammar. Try to use language that is appropriate. You don't want to use language that is going to, you don't want to use language that is trying to fluff up the study, right? You're trying to use information that will indeed send the study and is professional, but you don't want to sound colloquial either. You don't want to sound like you're hanging out with Dr. Shaw in Atlanta in a club, right? You don't want to sound like that. You also don't want to sound like you're the Queen of England, right? There is a balance between the two, right? Because if I hear you writing like you're the Queen of England, I'm going to assume you don't know anything, because you're trying to fluff up the language instead of trying to present the article in a way that can be bite-sized, that I can actually understand in a respectful manner. Do not use second persons. Do not use contractions. So for example, say do not. Don't use don't, right? Don't use can't. Use cannot, right? Don't use contractions, colloquialisms. So any word that's typical or that you use in everyday language. So you would say employment instead of job, right? You don't want to use everyday language, and don't use collective. And why don't you want to use collective? And this is actually a really good point, especially for those who are going to practice later. You don't want to use collective because you didn't do the study. That was part and her colleagues. It wasn't part and myself. So I don't want to say, we found that XYZ. We didn't found anything. We is too many people. We're not friends, right? So we want to make sure that we never use terms that are misleading. Because if somebody reads an article and it says us or our study, they're going to think, oh, look at that. Dr. Shaw wrote this paper. I didn't. It was part in how you're going to present that paragraph. Sometimes you're going to find yourself utilizing the singular pronoun. Make sure that you are correct and that you present participants reported. You want to use the actual number words. okay, instead of writing the unit of measure. APA does have different guidelines for that though. But for the sake of this paper, we're going to use that particular format. Never begin a sentence with a number. It is immensely confusing for the reader. So you want to say participants with a sample N of 50. You don't want to start that sentence, 50 participants were. This is immensely confusing. So what you like to do is always start with a word. So say participants with a sample of 50, that's what the notation of N means, is the amount of people that were present, were given a survey of motivation, instead of saying 50 participants with the number. Here are some examples of how the paragraph should look like. So for example, Park, STAM, colleagues 2010 investigated XYZ. The introduction defines, or you can say Park and all, say for instance, define, Park and colleagues reviewed. For the methods section, you want to use sentences such as the author recruited, the author instructed the individuals to do XYZ survey. And in the results, you can use this type of sentence. So for example, the result presents a significance value of an alpha of 0.05. Park and all found that when using the XYZ anxiety inventory, and you continue your sentence. And for the discussion, you can use a sentence such as, the discussion interprets XYZ, author and their colleagues explained that. So those are good examples as to what that would look like.